Welcome everyone to Webinar Wednesdays with the MSC program. So excited to see such a great turnout today. A few weeks ago, I emailed Professor Roloff and asked him to join. He's very gracious in joining us today. And we didn't know topics came to mind immediately with a lot of options. And I said, I think that we'll probably get a couple hundred people to show up to listen to you read a dictionary. That seems to be the case here, which is terrific. So I'm not going to, I could spend an hour introducing Mike here, given all the accolades, awards, writings, research that he's been a part of. I'm not going to do that. Google Mike Roloff Northwestern if you want to read all of that, please. We just spoke briefly here. He's in the middle of his 43rd year teaching at Northwestern University. He's been teaching in the change management world since the inception of the MSC program. Today's topic is going to have to do with remote working pre, during, and potentially post the pandemic. And I'm excited and going to quickly get out of the way here. But Mike, thanks so much for joining us. It's all yours.
Not a problem. Well, the old buffalo is still here, much to the chagrin of some. I am still functioning as best I can in this kind of an environment. You know, when I want to thank you all for coming to endure listening to me again. That's always gratifying. I always worry that at some point I will be completely irrelevant. But anyway, it's nice to know that there are people who still kind of consider what it is that I have to say. When Toby got in touch with me, I was in the middle of grading papers. Some of you may know we're getting close to the end of the winter quarter, so I had two classes, an MSc class, an undergraduate class, and I was grading about 100 papers. So it took a while for me to get back to him when he contacted me, and I apologize for being slow, but I was kind of brain dead in doing all that. And I said, well, what should I talk about? And he says, well, whatever's on your mind, you know, something that, you know, would be relevant. And I sort of viewed that as the low-hanging fruit because I've been thinking about it. And I said, well, geez, what have I been thinking about? And as you might well guess, it's all going to be bad. It's all going to be problem-focused and stuff like that. So I was sitting there trying to think about, well, what have I been dwelling on? And at that time, I looked out the window and there was nothing but snow and cold. And I suddenly said, well, you know, those of you remember my class, the first few minutes before we ever talked, all we did was complain about the weather, right? Chicago weather, the really important thing. So I was sort of sitting there going, yeah, you know, weather's still bad. I tried to take care of my snow thrower and the snow hit and I went out to start it and it wouldn't start. I had done all the things in the spring you were supposed to do and the snow thrower would not start. So I had to go and get it repaired. So that was my first lesson. Always never trust that it's going to start no matter what you do. And then I got it back before the next snow hit and the thing broke, a cable broke and the thing wouldn't turn. So I had to take it back in to get it repaired. And then, you know, my dog, I'm still taking my dog for walks and we go 5 miles a day and it snowed and he still wanted to go for a walk. So I had to develop what I call the roll-off roll. I had to learn how to fall on ice. And so I found myself rolling into snow drifts and I was so thankful for those people who didn't shovel because there was this cushion of snow. But then I thought, well, you know, that's too personal. There's nothing there that you'd want to hear about that. And so then I thought, well, what else have I been considering? Well, I am an old buffalo. You know, as you just heard, I've been at Northwestern 43 years and 48 years as a professor, and must admit, retirement is something that I've been thinking about. And how do you do that? And so I've been out there trying to explore what you do when you leave and actually reading research on how you make sense out of retirement, what the different plans are and so forth. But then I thought, many of you are not old buffaloes and you don't need to hear about all that. And so then I thought, well, I know some of you may remember that my wife and I have a couple of timeshares on Maui and we go there every Christmas. And this year was a challenge given the pandemic and so forth. And I give Hawaii credit. They have really, far more than what I think happens in the mainland, they're trying to control things. And so I had to figure out, how do you get into Hawaii given all the restrictions? So I had to read Hawaiian rules, and it turns out that each of the islands has different rules. And they take them seriously. If you come over and you don't have a negative test, they quarantine you for 2 weeks and they monitor you. So if you go somewhere, they catch you and force you off the island. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to do that. And I thought, can't get an hour's worth of stuff out of that. And then I said, well, I've been trying to get a vaccination, the great vaccination chase. And so I'm developing all these tactics and strategies aimed at how I can do that, and managed to secure 3 appointments, all of which got canceled before I got there. So Roloff luck was continuing, and I was like, wow, how do I get this done? And I really can't say that I came up with an effective strategy. I mean, my strategy really consisted of mobilizing my children and friends who were out there helping me. And I finally scored one. So I've had one down and another one next week, but couldn't get an hour out of that. And so then I said to myself, the thing that really is important that I can talk about in a way that's had an impact on me and might be of interest to you is, what has this all meant for how organizations have changed? We're in the middle of the pandemic, and it's had a big impact on me. And I suspect it's had an impact on you, but it's interesting to sort of look at the data to see how far that impact has occurred. I mean, if I look back to where I was a year ago, finishing the change management class, I remember vividly in January and February hearing something about the coronavirus before they started talking about it being COVID, trying to figure out what it was all about, people getting very concerned about it, knowing there was some action that was going to happen at Northwestern, but I wasn't sure what it was going to be. The last week of classes, suddenly hearing they're going to shut it down. They're going to shut it down. And I was sitting there, again, not nearly as panicked as other people, but thinking, I got one more lecture to do. I got one more lecture. And so I called up the folks at Northwestern, the IT people, and I said, I got one more lecture to do. So they opened up 1421. And so I went in there and I recorded my last lecture, and I thought, closure. Was that really good? And unbeknownst to me, I was going to spend the next year recording lectures and transforming everything I did into the remote environment. And some of you may remember, I wasn't a big fan of that. I had bad experiences when we had tried to do sort of a blended approach in our classes where some people were there and some of them were watching in video and so forth. And I kind of resolved I'd never do that again. And of course, 1 year later, I've transformed all of my classes into remote instruction, and begrudgingly have kind of learned how to do it because in my mind, it was a safer alternative, but it was not easy. Tiny little things where I did all my stuff asynchronously. So I was recording myself, and all of a sudden I discovered that the internet connection in my house varied by room. And so I would be about 3/4 through a presentation, and suddenly I'd see a notice, you have no internet connection. And then I'd have to figure out, what am I going to do? How do I edit that? Had several times where I'm in the middle of my presentation and suddenly garbage trucks come rolling down the street, and there's this, or back when the weather was nice, I was doing my presentation and all of the people cutting grass seemed to show up at the same time. And then I'd be in the middle of the presentation and my dog would decide that he wants to get excited. And he would be out there yelping and all the other dogs in the neighborhood. So after a while, I was sort of like, wow, this is a major hassle. It was so much easier and a lot more fun to look at you all face to face and see the interaction and stuff like that, and not worry about the dog barking and all the rest of that stuff. But didn't have any choice. And so I sort of made the transition into how to doing this. As much as I really would prefer to sort of going back to the way it was, I sort of adjusted. So then I started thinking about, well, this is a great topic for organizational change. And I tried to think back about how we would approach it from a change perspective to try to make sense out of it. And one way I did that was to think back about topics that you may remember I talked about in my organizational change class that are kind of different from what has happened to us. Those of you at my change class remember me talking about there were perspectives out there that said organizations won't change unless there's a crisis. I used to refer to it as you have to see blood flowing down the hallway to get people to change. And sometimes you have to see the bodies of friends floating on the top of the blood to get the organization to change. This was a crisis, something that that people weren't quite ready to face. And it took a lot of immediate reaction to get them to do something. Not only that, my perception was there weren't a lot of organizations that had backup plans for this kind of crisis. That in crisis management, there's always been this complaint that organizations do not develop very detailed plans to figure out what to do. And I suspect none of them had any plans for what to do during a pandemic. Also, it was a situation that required a great deal of, there was time pressure. People felt like they had to do something. And you remember from my organizational change class, when you have to make decisions under pressure, you oftentimes don't make good decisions. You just have to do something to get it done. And I think we saw some of that. It was also compliance driven. Didn't always have a whole lot of choices as to how we were going to do that. People from the top said, we need to do it. Sometimes there were implementation problems that occurred. People weren't ready to figure out how to do this. I must admit, when I found out that at the beginning of the spring quarter, that both of my classes were going to be remote, I was panicked. I was trying to figure out how to do it. As you know, I didn't have a very positive attitude toward this type of teaching to begin with. I had not investigated how you would do it. And so I was trying to find the simplest and quickest way to get this thing done. And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. And of course, the last thing that's kind of important about it is that it's still unfolding. We're not out of the woods yet. And the changes that have already started, we're not quite certain what it's going to look at the end. And so if you look at the literature, there's lots of debates and opinions about what the new normal is going to look like. So from a change management perspective, it can give us some unique things to study and to think about and to figure out how we will adjust to. Now, in looking at all the things we could focus on, I'm only going to look at two. The first one was the fact that we've moved to remote work. Lots of people have moved to remote work. Speaking for myself personally, I've been doing some form of this for ages. I learned very quickly that I did my best writing and some of my best research at home. In fact, you can see behind me my messy office, and I've got another messy office over in another office. So if I hit a writer's block, I just move to the other office and I can start working again. But I have a lot of stuff here. And so in that sense, it wasn't a big surprise to me. In fact, I think I've only been on campus 4 times since March. So, but prior to that, I was coming in basically to teach and to go to a few meetings, and that was about it. But so remote did impact me. It reduced even further my presence on campus, but I've been doing it for quite some time. Now, when we look at remote work, what I tried to do is to go back and look at the research on remote work to give you an idea that it's not entirely a new concept so that we can understand what impact it's had since the pandemic. There's been research on people working remotely for a long time. It really started in the 1970s. We just didn't call it remote work. It had a lot of other terms. So they called it telecommuting or distributed work or telework or flexible work in addition to remote work. It's a great thing. Some of you may remember me making fun of in organizational change. There's a thing called the jibber jabber effect. And the jibber jabber effect is where to sometimes create change. You take something and you label it as something different so people don't remember what it was when it began. That way it always looks new. Or sometimes what you do is you take 2 things that are indeed the same and you label them different when they're really the same. It's sort of a sleight of hand to get things by people. And academicians are generally noted for the jibber jabber effect. And I think to some extent, that's what we've got here. We've been studying people working not from the office for a long time. Now, what I wanted to do is I want to take a classic definition so we can begin to figure out what the research really means of what we mean by telecommuting. And this one was developed by Alan Golden and Shockley. And they defined, it's another one of those long academic things, where telecommuting is a work practice that involves members of an organization substituting a portion of their typical work hours, and that can range from a few hours per week to nearly full time, to work away from a central workplace, typically from home, using technology to interact with others as needed to conduct their work tasks. As I said, they've been studying this process for it wasn't caused by the pandemic. In fact, if you look at the history of telecommuting, it goes back to the 1970s. Now, old buffaloes like me actually remember that time period. Really, where the idea of telecommuting came about was during the oil crisis, when all of a sudden OPEC began to embargo oil, and we were sitting there going, how are we going to handle that? People aren't going to have enough gasoline to get to work and stuff like that. And so people said, let people work from home. And that's well before the internet, where they were telling people, maybe this is something that we should do. So it wasn't pandemic oriented in terms of illness. It was really driven by our reaction to a threat to our ability to drive to and from work. Then it evolved from that. Once the oil crisis went over, then all of a sudden it became popular again because they saw it as a way of attracting in-demand workers, people who had special skills, who also had the skill set to work at home. So it was used for computer scientists, computer developers, and so forth. So now we're beginning to talk about computers playing a role in this. They knew how to use the technology and they wanted to stay home. And they said, this could be a good way of doing that. It also was expanded to try to deal with work-family conflict. We have dual career marriages. So we had both partners who are out working. You get more work-family pressure and stuff like that. And they thought, maybe this is a way to allow employees to better deal with the demands of the workplace as well as dealing with their families. Then it evolved and became popular again because they thought it might be a way of dealing with fuel emissions. In other words, taking care of the problems we've got with the environment. If people are working from home, they don't have to drive cars as much. I actually looked at some research on that, and they found that when it comes to fuel emissions, people working at home's a wash, because it's true that I've noticed this in my own. Remember, I've only gone to campus 4 times, so I'm not driving in there as much as I did. So not using nearly as much gasoline. The problem is for some people when they're working at home, they don't go to work as much, but they start traveling to do shopping and stuff like that more in the house, which increases or offsets the savings that come from driving to work to doing more home kinds of things in the community. So that turns out to be a bit of a wash. But over time, as I tried to get estimates, there have been increases in the number of people who are working from home up until the big jumps occurred between about 2005 to 2012. So as I said, this is not a new trend that we're looking at. There have been people who've been doing this for quite some time. Now, there's always been some controversy attached to it. Some companies have tried it and changed their mind and said, we're not going to do this anymore. There's always been pressure, more pressure, I think, from employees to be able to work from home, with resistance coming from management. Management's not sold on it. They've been skeptical about how hard people will work if they're not being monitored all the time. The mice will play when the cat's away. So you really there's been some real resistance to doing this. And there have been some claims that are made about it. Claims that don't turn out to be entirely true. I remember one company that changed its mind. The CEO said, so much is learned and so much innovation occurs at the coffee machine, and that people talk to each other and they share ideas and it's all synergetic. But if you go back and look for evidence that that happens very frequently, you can't find it. So what I did is I went back initially and said, let's look at what the research said about telecommuting before the pandemic. And that way we get an idea of, when we look at research now, what effect it's actually had. Now, I'm going to give you some summary stuff. First area that we were very much interested is work non-work. In other words, does it resolve the problem between workplace intruding in your family and your family intruding in the workplace? The research that was done prior to the pandemic indicated that telecommuting does reduce work to family conflict, but not to a large degree. In other words, there is an improvement. People who are working from home say, My work intrudes less into my family than those who are working in the office, but it's not a huge effect. So they tried to figure out why. Well, part of it has to do with how much do you work from home versus going into the office. So what the research tended to indicate, that people who telecommute 2.5 days per week have a greater reduction than those who are at home more often. So the key figure was 2.5. Once you were staying home more than 2.5, then you got some real benefits from this. But if you were still coming in, you weren't staying as home nearly as much, the benefit wasn't as great. They also discovered that individuals who've been telecommuting for a longer time experience less conflict than those who just started. There seemed to be an adjustment effect. And if you've been doing this for a while, you figure out the routine so that you know how to get everything done. Those who have been doing it for a shorter period of time, they don't get the benefit as much. And a key factor was telecommuting does not, or did not, reduce the level to which your personal life influences your work. It only reduced the workplace coming into the family. People working from home were not experiencing less family intruding on work. Now that's where I got to qualify it a little bit. One of the things we know, because I cover in not my change management class, but I teach an OrgComm class, I cover stuff on conflict between work and family. And what you tend to find is people do report that work tends to mess up more of their family life than their family life messes up their work. So there's not a lot of family intruding on work to begin with, but when you look at telecommuting, there's no savings that tends to occur there. So there is an effect. It's more among some groups than others. It just isn't a big effect. Second thing they looked at was job satisfaction. They tended to find that individuals who were telecommuters had more positive attitudes toward their jobs than those who tend to work in the office. They like their jobs better when they're working from home. There is a limit to that. It's hard to define by each study, but there's a certain level of working at home where you reach that, you are particularly happy with your job, and if you do more than that, it doesn't have much of an impact. So it's a curved linear, it plateaus at some level. Organizational commitment. Research indicates that people who are telecommuters are more committed to their organization than those who are office workers. But a lot of it has to do with whether they feel that they have a psychological preference or presence at work. That psychologically they feel they are part of the company. If you're really working from home and you don't feel like psychologically you have any connection to the company, then the identification isn't going to be there. Big advantage. Individuals who work from home report that they feel less stress than those who work in the office. And remember when I OrgComm class or my change class, I talk about burnout, particularly in terms of being emotionally exhausted at the end of the day. Research indicated that telecommuters are less emotionally exhausted at the end of the day than people who work in the office. Next one, which organizations care a lot about, is productivity. And here the research is kind of interesting. The research finds that if you ask supervisors to evaluate how productive their subordinates are, those supervisors who are supervising telecommuters report they are more productive than those who are supervising those who are in the office, which has always been one of the concerns, as I said, about management, is management just doesn't quite believe people are going to be working that hard. But if you look at supervisor ratings, those who are working at home are getting better productivity ratings than those who are working in the office, okay? The other thing that they've found in the literature is they got what they call objective indicators of productivity, how much you actually accomplish that they can put on a numerical basis. And again, they find that individuals who work from home are more productive than those who work in the office. Now, where it becomes interesting that I still find kind of strange, if you ask individuals, though, who are working at home versus those in the office, how productive they are, you don't get a big difference when it comes to self-reports. Most of the time, I think we would anticipate that people exaggerate their self-reports, and it may well be when it comes to self-reports, both people at home and people who are working in the office are so exaggerating their reports, there doesn't seem to be any difference. But there seems to be productivity gains that come from people working at home. There is no relationship, difference rather, between people who work in the office and people who are working at home in terms of their salaries and their potential for career development, okay? And one benefit for the company is people who work from home are they're less likely to be thinking about quitting their jobs than people who are working in the office. The people who are working in the office are sort of like, I'm not that happy with my job. And remember, a good predictor of wanting to quit is not being very satisfied. So not surprisingly, people who are working at home are less likely to be thinking about quitting. Now, why? Does there seem to be some benefit anyway from working at home? Well, there have been several different things they've identified. Number one, people who work from home have greater feelings of job autonomy. They feel like they have more freedom to work on their job, more independence, more discretion. And it turns out that employees like freedom. Big surprise, right? They really like that discretion and willingness to choose. Remember in my class, I talked about psychological reactants. Nobody likes being told what to do. Well, individuals who are working from home have more discretion. They feel better about the way they're working. They aren't being monitored all that much. Second reason, and this one's close to my heart, people who work from home avoid meetings. They can avoid meetings. They don't have as many distractions while they're working. They don't have as many people coming in to bother them. And they avoid office politics. It's so funny because so many people like to think of the office place as being this wonderful kumbaya, let's all get together. Oh, it's wonderful. We love each other. And that's so discrepant from my experience. That the workplace and the office is filled with Byzantine politics and backstabbing and plotting and stuff like that, which increase your stress and But the other reason they found that people like working from home, and this is in some ways the most practical, pragmatic reason, is people get to avoid commuting. Whoa, right? Not necessarily the Byzantine politics. You don't have to drive to work. Even though, those of you who remember my OrgCom class, at the beginning of every class, not only did we have a group sort of groan about Chicago weather, we had a group groan about trying to find parking, right? That damn ramp that we all drive around in, trying to figure out where are we going to find parking. And particularly on football games when Ohio State comes in and everything is filled. I don't miss driving to work. I miss seeing the students. I don't miss driving to work. Driving around that ramp, if I never drive around the ramp again, that's great, okay? Now, this doesn't work for everybody. They've gone through trying to figure out, do some people benefit more than others do? So the positive effects of telecommuting, to some degree, depends on also your scheduling. Some people who work from home have very rigid schedules that they have to follow. And it turns out that if you have rigid schedules when you're working at home, many of the benefits we just talked about goes away because you don't have discretion, you don't have autonomy, you've got to be there doing it at this particular time. So many of those warm and fuzzy feelings that come from working at home disappear if you're working on the same 9 to 5 schedule. The only difference is you're at home as opposed to doing it in the office. Also, it depends on your task interdependence. Do you do things on your job that don't require the input of anybody else? Right? You are responsible for this and you don't have to worry about somebody else getting their thing done. You basically are an independent player. For independent players, working from home is great. Individuals who have to depend on other people to get their job done, they don't get the same kind of benefit. Also, and this was a biggie people complained about, people who telecommute report that they don't have very good relationships with their colleagues compared to those who work in the office. You don't get the coffee machine interaction and things like that that you get when you're actually present. But one thing I found intriguing about this research, which I would have never have expected to find, is people who are telecommuters report that they have a better relationship with their boss than people who work in the office. So while their relationship with their coworkers seem to diminish, their relationship with their superiors tends to increase. And maybe that has to do with the fact that maybe they're not being monitored as closely. Some of the things we complain most about our bosses are a little bit harder to do when you're working at home, okay? So all of that stuff gives you a snapshot of what we knew about remote working before the pandemic hit, okay? Now, I want to transition into what's happened since the pandemic hit, and I'm going to be relying on, there are lots of studies when I got ready to do this, and many of them are being run by individuals, I think, who are making money off of this, so I'm a little bit suspicious of them. I found a good study that was done by the Pew Corporation, or the Pew Company, and essentially what they did was a study where they went out and they interviewed over 6,000 adults. They got a good sampling, looks a lot like the United States. It was done from about October 13th through the 19th of last year. And what they wanted to do was to interview these people to find out what's happened since the pandemic started. And we're going to find, they're going to talk about remote working, okay? So what do we find overall? First part I found really intriguing because I wouldn't have predicted this, particularly if you read a lot in the media or listen to prognosticators about what's happening. It's sort of like, things have changed dramatically. Well, they wanted to find out, do people report that there have been big changes since the pandemic occurred, regardless of where they're working? So I put together the study, the findings they've got. Overall, at least what they measured, most people report there haven't been any changes. So for example, 64% of the sample reported they had not had any change in satisfaction with their job since the pandemic started. They weren't any less happy or happier. 23% reported, though, they were less satisfied. But still, 64% said, I feel the same about my job as I did when this thing started. 58% reported that they had no change in the number of hours they were working, and 15% reported that they were actually working fewer hours as a result of all this. 65% report no change in their productivity, with 16% reporting they were less productive. 60% reported they had no change in work-life balance, although 25% reported getting work-life balance was more difficult for them. 55% reported no change in connectedness to their colleagues, although 33% reported they felt less connected. That kind of goes back to what I was talking about, the general research on telecommuting again, with some people say, I just don't have that connection with my colleagues anymore. 70% reported they had no change in their feelings of job security, that in essence, they hadn't become more concerned about whether they're going to do it. And 19% reported they had some concern about losing their job. 76% reported there was no change in job advancement. They felt like, I could still move ahead in my company. 19% reported there was a reduction. I find those things kind of interesting because we've got a lot of people who seem to be reporting, yeah, the pandemic hit, but my feelings about my job, my potential in my job, most things really haven't changed that much for them. Now, one thing that has changed is the remote working. Only 1 in 5 reported that they worked mainly from home before the pandemic. So what, 20%? After the pandemic occurred, 71% reported they now work from home all or most of the time. So there has been a big jump in people working at home. So now, how are they reporting? What's it like to be working at home? So all these figures are now referring to the people who are working at home at least some of the time or all of the time. Again, I was amazed when I started going through the data. 87% who were working at home reported they had adequate technology to do their job. In other words, they didn't need anything new to do. They had the stuff that was available to them. 13% reported they had difficulty getting the technology to work to get their job or to do their job at home. 80% reported that they were able to meet deadlines and complete projects on time with little difficulty. 19% reported that they had problems. But again, I was surprised. Only 2% reported they had significant problems being able to do that. 77% reported they had adequate workplace or space at home. 23% reported they had problems finding workspace. 68% reported they could get their work done at home without any interruptions at all. There was no difficulty with it. 32% reported they had problems. 4% said very difficult problems were encountered. 64% reported they were motivated to do their work. 35% said they had problems with that. 8% said they had real trouble trying to get motivated to get their work done at the time. So again, if we look at what's among those individuals who are working at home, most of them seem to be doing okay with it. Doesn't seem to be any huge problems that they're encountering. And although I didn't write down the figure, consistent with what we had before, most of the people working at home reported that they felt like they were given clearer instructions and were getting along better with their boss than they did early on with this. So they were saying there was some improvement. Now, this becomes critical in this. What about those individuals who had never done this before? The first group that I was giving you up there, those people had some level of experience doing this before. This is just looking at the newbies, the ones who had never worked at home before and then started. Among those who had never remotely worked before, 46% of those who were now working remotely reported greater time flexibility. The same kind of improvement did not occur for those who had been doing it before. I think what that really is getting at is, like old buffaloes like me who've been doing the homework before, the advantages aren't all that great as a result of the pandemic and spending more time doing it. It's like you've already adjusted. But for the newbies, the ones who'd never done this before, they reported some improvement. Of those who started working remotely, 30% reported they had an easier time balancing work and family. If we look at the ones who had been doing this before and there wasn't that big an increase, it was only about a 7% improvement. However, among those who started working remotely, and this is going to go back to the same finding we had before, for those who suddenly began doing this, 65% reported that they had less connection to their coworkers than they had before, whereas those who had been doing this for a while, only 27% reported that. So again, it's the same kind of pattern. Those who sort of took it up, particularly they'd never done it before, they got some improvement relative to those who had been doing it all along, which doesn't surprise me. They probably got the improvement way back when they started doing this before the pandemic. But it does appear there is a little bit of a loss of connection with the coworkers that occur. Now, this should surprise you too, at least it did me, is that they went back through and they wanted to look at particular things like motivational issues. Are there subgroups who could have problems with this? This one amazed me, given the stereotypes of what people have been saying out there about generational differences and so forth. What they basically found is that there was loss of motivation among some groups that varied in their age, how old they were. Now, these are pretty gross categories of ages when you look at them. They lump together lots of different generations in my mind, but that's the way they did it. 42% of those employees aged 18 to 49 reported difficulty being motivated to work when they were working at home. So you've got not quite half, over 40% report, I had a motivational problem. I got up in the morning, I just didn't want to do anything, right? You know, I was working from home, I just didn't want to do it. However, of those who include old buffaloes like me, and those of you who don't like being old buffaloes, don't take offense when I say what the age range are. The 20, those who were ages, or were 50 or older, okay, the old buffalo range, only 20% reported they lost motivation. So when we go to the 18 to 49, 42% reported, I'm working at home, I have trouble really getting going. And of those who are the older ones, the 50 or older, only 20% reported they had problems with that. And if we start looking at interruptions, getting your work done, of those who were 18 to 49, 38% reported they had problems with interruptions at home that prevented them from getting their work done, whereas only 18% of those who were 50 or older reported they had any problems with interruptions at work. So one of the things they were beginning to wonder about is, why is there this age difference? And as I said, many of us tend to view the old buffaloes as being technologically challenged and things like that, and they may have problems really adjusting to working at home, and that doesn't seem to be the case. Most of them seem to be able to figure out how to do this, and some who were younger reported that they had some difficulty doing it. The researchers didn't have any clear insight. Some people suggested that maybe what happens is that among younger people, they're so used to using information technology and so forth for social reasons, work reason, and so forth, that they had a harder time adjusting to just doing it for work, as opposed to the social aspects, getting involved with it, making it hard to get their work done. You know, there's been a big debate out there about old boomers like me and how dedicated and fixated we are on our jobs relative to the younger groups. And maybe what happens if that's true, that old buffaloes like me are so used to working, we're going to work regardless of the context that we're in, and we're going to be able to survive this thing relative to younger generations. But they don't really know. The second thing that they found with this isn't a surprise, and I think it might give us some insight as to why they got the age difference. Half of remote workers, about 50% of remote workers who have children younger than 18, indicate they have trouble getting work done without interruption. Only 20% of those without children report they have problems with interruptions. Parents with children who are older than 18 report as few problems with interruptions as those who have no children at all. And what I found intriguing when it comes to interruptions, I think immediately we'd think, boy, this is probably impacting mom more than it is dad. And they found there was no different. Dads report, 48% of dads who have kids in that young group are reporting they have trouble with interruptions, and 50% of mothers, more mothers than dads, but 52-48 are pretty much the same. That could be a function, or could give us a little bit of an idea of why some of the age differences were there, particularly if those, given how wide the 18 to 49 range is, you could have people in that younger group who are parents with young kids, and they're the ones who are going to be encountering what some of these problems are. This one I can relate to. I'm an old buffalo, as you know. There ain't nobody here but my wife and my dog. And so the only interruptions I ever got when I was doing my recordings and so forth was the dog barking, or occasionally a telephone would go off. But otherwise, I didn't get many interruptions. I could sort of charge my way through all of this. My daughters, you may remember I have 3 daughters. I have 7 grandchildren. With all goes well in April, May, I'll have 8 grandchildren. I got to watch up close and personal what the impact of all of this stuff has on parents who have small children, and it became a nightmare for them. All my daughters are married to men who also have careers, and it was really, really stressful to figure out who was going to watch the kids at any given time, and they all have very young children, and trying to manage all of that stuff. So that's where you did find there were some difficulties that came with having to work from home. But again, it was kind of peculiar or idiosyncratic to the extent that we had schools that were closed. And all of a sudden you had people not only trying to figure out, how do I get my work done? Who's going to watch the kids? And with my daughters and my son-in-laws, oftentimes they had meetings scheduled, Zoom meetings, that occurred at exactly the same time. So they were trying to figure out who's going to watch the kids and how do we keep the kids under control while all of this was happening. Now, in addition, back to this, 38% reported that that their jobs could be done at home. So we've got about 38% of the sample overall said, you know, I can do my job at home. I don't really need to do there. But we get a bias built into it. It was mostly individuals who are well educated who reported they could do their job as well at home as they could in the office. As education went down, individuals reported, no, my job really couldn't be done there. Also, with increasing income, larger percentages report the job could be done at home. And again, income and education are going to be correlated, so that's not a big surprise. The potential for doing the job at home is really high among people who are paid well and are well educated. Not surprisingly, employees in information technology sector, banking, financing, and education are most likely to say that their job could be done at home. And those are going to be generally high-paying jobs. Those who work in retail, manufacturing, transportation, and healthcare report that their jobs must be done at home. Now, the key factor in this research is what people want going forward. You know what's happened since the pandemic. What are people reporting they want to do as we move ahead? Of those working from home, 54% report that if they're given a choice, they would prefer to continue working from home after the pandemic ends. So a little over half of them say, you know, when this thing's over with, I want to stay at home. Of those who never or rarely remote worked in the past, okay, these are people who never had a choice to do it to begin with. They are newbies. 46% would like to continue working from home after the pandemic ends. Men and women did not differ in their preference to continue working from home, although there was a slight difference with more women than men saying they would like to work at home all the time. Okay? Preference to continue to work from home did not differ among parents and non-parents, regardless of the age of the child. So it looks like, in terms of impact, if we had to sort of summarize, there's not huge impacts to begin with. They're kind of spotty among some groups. Parents with young kids are having a bigger problem than no parents and those with kids who are older. Age difference, there's a surprise with younger as opposed to older employees, at least having some problems more than others. But it looks like those who generally want to continue doing this after it's over with. Now, found another study. This one is being done by another academic group. It's ongoing, it's not done yet, but they wanted to see what are managerial reactions. All the stuff we talked about are how employees are thinking. So this one's focused on managers and how do they view all of this stuff. Now, going into it, based on resistance in the past, they thought managers are going to be pretty resistant to this stuff. You know, they're going to be suspicious. So what they did is research. They got people from 24 different countries, a lot of different types of organizations. The first wave is in, so it's not done yet. What they found, 40% of managers reported they have very little self-confidence in how to manage remote employees. They just don't know how to do it. They don't know what the strategy should be, et cetera. This was especially common, and this isn't going to surprise anybody. They were especially lacking in self-confidence if they were very, very young, meaning they don't have much experience in it, and if their company provided them with very little training how to deal with remote workers. Of the entire sample, only 23% of the managers reported they had a high degree of confidence about how to do this. So it might not just be skepticism. There's low self-efficacy. They don't have any experience doing it. The company didn't give them any training for how to do this. In addition, 38% felt that remote workers typically perform worse than those who work on site. So we've got about 30% of them who aren't saying I've got low self-efficacy. They're saying people slack off when they're not there. 22% said they weren't certain whether they slack off or not, but 40%, almost as many who were skeptical, said, I think they perform as well. 41% were skeptical that remote workers remain motivated as they continue to work. 17% were unsure. In addition, managers who felt themselves were micromanaged by their bosses, sort of like it's the culture. The people at the top watch the people below who watch, and it just goes down the rankings. Those who felt they were micromanaged by their own managers had the most negative views of the performance of remote workers. So the idea was it starts at the top. If there's a lot of monitoring at the top, it just basically works its way down to the bottom and you get a lot of mistrust. Now, They also are finding, even though the study's not done yet, this mistrust can spill over to employees. So they included in their sample, not just managers, but those who are reporting. 21% of remote employees report that their managers micromanage them. They're in touch with them every day. They're monitoring exactly what they're doing. 34% felt that their manager did not trust their abilities. 50% said that they always had to be accessible for any contact from their supervisor. And all of these factors increase the level of stress of the employees and their work-family conflict. So again, you know, we've got sort of this viewpoint that maybe with the exception of losing contact with their colleagues, the people are going through this and are working remotely aren't feeling too bad about it. Managers are still a little bit uncomfortable with it because they haven't been trained to do it. Their self-efficacy isn't all that great. And some of them have bad attitudes. And when they have bad attitudes, that oftentimes is reflected in their behavior towards the employees, and you get problems. So everything I talked about is just related to remote working. A second thing that is related to that I want to talk about is the use of communication technologies. You know, one of the things in the definition of telecommunication, or telecommuting rather, is the idea that you're having to use technology to get in touch with other individuals. So they're related to each other, although back in the old days, in the 1970s, it was basically telephones and things like that as opposed to using the internet. There's obviously been a lot of research out there that's been done on the use of technologies in the workplace. And a lot of it is focused on how beneficial and innovative and wonderful it can be. You know me, I don't believe anything. So I started looking for the bad things. And you can find some bad things that maybe are going to start showing up in what's happened during the pandemic. There is research out there that indicates that at high levels of technology use, the more information technology or the more frequently used, it leads to information overload, which can increase stress and burnout symptoms. Idea is you can be overwhelmed by this stuff after a while. And that could occur before the pandemic occurred. I mean, I'm always, as you know, I grade all my papers online. I get lots of email. I'm online all the time, right? And there are days where it's just, you know, this is awful. Usually this happens about a week before the papers are due. And then all of a sudden people I haven't heard from for weeks suddenly are in touch with me. I need an answer right now. And it just, and they found that people who are sort of under that model not only become stressed out, but they burn out. Remember I said poor Toby got in touch with me about doing this when I was in the middle of grading 100 papers. I was about as close to burnout as I've been for a while. I was just wiped out as a result of all that. So you reach a level of stress where suddenly you just can't deal with it anymore and just boom, can't do anything. And there's research out there that says when it comes to information technology, the more frequently you use it and the more complex the technology is, the greater the attention that it requires from you. You're having to pay attention to the technology, how to use it, the stuff coming through. And guess what? The more attention you're paying to the technology and the information, the less attention you're paying to get your work done. And as a result, it crowds out productivity. I don't know about you, but there are days when I get high volumes of email and it seems like all I do is read email and respond to it and I don't get any other tasks done that I'm supposed to get done, right? It's crowding out productivity as a result of this. Now, it only happens at the high levels where you're getting so much of it that you're saturated. So when we start looking at the pandemic, there are people out there who said, maybe this is happening to us now, that we're working from home more. The only way we can get in touch with each other is through Zoom and these other devices. And as a result of it, we're getting overwhelmed, right? Our anxiety, we're just basically wiped out as a result of all of it. So I found a study, which I thought was really kind of intriguing, the Philpus et al. And what they were able to do was to look at, particularly when organizations were locking down, when the society was saying stay home, And they looked at it in North America, Europe, and Middle East, and they somehow got internal information about meetings, numbers of people who were attending, email activity, etc. And they wanted to see, was there a spike? When all of a sudden we had to really sort of work at home because we were forced to lockdown, what happened? Well, a lot of what happens isn't a big surprise. Essentially, when they locked down, they found there was an increase in the number of meetings that had to take place. Part of that could be crisis generated. Part of it was people just adapting, saying, we got to continue to work. So the number of meetings went up right after the lockdown. The number of people who attended the meetings increased dramatically after the lockdown. So not only was it the case that I got more meetings, but I got more people who read all of these things. Now, the part that I thought was intriguing, and this part kind of makes sense from a crowding out perspective, but I wouldn't have anticipated it. The number of meetings increased, the number of people in the meetings increased, but the length of the meetings went down. So we were in more meetings, but shorter meetings than what we had before. And I think part of that was a crowding out effect. That what happened is there were greater demands to have more meetings with different groups of people. And so there was not enough time for any of those meetings to last very long. So people reduced the amount of time that they were spending in any given meeting. Now, because most of that stuff is going to involve particular types of technology, that caused people to suddenly become concerned about, is indeed Zoom burning us out? And I found lots of stuff where people were speculating about Zoom fatigue. And admittedly, probably because of my general attitude towards some technology, began to feel it. But there were people who started writing about this. And they said, what we're going through now is not necessarily a fun thing. A guy named Bailenson, who does a lot of research comparing computer mediation with face-to-face interaction, wrote an article in 2020 where he was speculating. He didn't have any data, but he was speculating why Zoom might be especially difficult for us to deal with. So he came up with 4 reasons based on his research. Number one of them is that when you look at Zoom, the faces are much larger in our visualization than what we would see proportionally if we were interacting with other people. And those faces stare at you for a longer period of time. And what he discovers, which makes sense in face-to-face interaction, we don't stare each other down that much, and the faces are proportional, out of proportion, I mean, unless you got a big, really big head, to the rest of the body. So, I mean, you're interacting with other people, and you're going, oh, yeah, and, you know, if you stare at them long enough, they kind of go, that's creepy. That's creepy. Right? And so we all come, it's like that elevator thing. You know, the worst thing you do is get on a crowded elevator and stare at the face of the people who are there. That's asking for a fight, right? So, but suddenly on Zoom, you can't do that. All you're seeing are these faces, right? And he says all the research indicates that in face-to-face interaction, the more that face is dominating, the higher your stress is. In fact, some people made the argument that when people get into fights with each other, that's when they stare at each other longest. We're a little like canines. Any of you have had dogs, you can always tell when a dog fight's about to occur because they stare at each other. Well, the same kind of stress is there. Second thing, he says why Zoom creates so much stress on our part is it requires so much cognitive effort to figure out what's going on, right? You know, you're sort of sitting there and you're seeing these nonverbal cues and it's coming from lots of different people and you don't know how to read it. Those of you who remember me talking in class, I tend to read nonverbal cues. I loved it. I'd sit there and look at all of you, and you poor people who were in the front row had to deal with the fact I was leaning over you and staring at you. And any of you who appeared to be sleeping, I'd go up there, you know, so I'm feeding. I got too many faces out there. And they're all in little boxes. They're all in little bitty boxes. And I can't tell what all this means. And for me to figure out, am I doing a good job? If I'm doing a bad job, do I need to tell a story? I can't do that. So that creates stress. Third, and I hate this one, and he's right. Not only do I see little bitty boxes with faces in them that I can't really interpret, I see myself. I see myself. My wife does tell me I'm the most narcissistic entity in the world, but I got to tell you, I don't like seeing myself, right? And there's that box with me looking at myself. And I found myself going nuts when I would record these things for asynchronous presentation. I got so tired of hearing and watching myself that just, ugh. And there's actually a theory that explains that. There's a theory called the theory of objective self-awareness. And it says that people hate thinking about themselves because when you think about yourself, you start automatically evaluating yourself. And that's the reason why there are narcissists who like to look at themselves in the mirror. But most people, you come and you look at yourself, you quickly groom and get away from it. But if you sit there and stare at yourself long enough, you think, God, I gained weight. I can't believe I'm this gray. I was doing this. Who is that old man? That old man. I don't remember becoming that old man, right? I referred to myself as an old buffalo. I didn't realize how bad I looked until I started doing this. And then I could see this stuff and I had clear evidence of that. So the argument is, Zoom makes you more self-aware, which increases your stress and lowers your self-esteem. And the last thing he says that creates a problem with this, and you're seeing I'm going through this now, I like to be animated. In the old days, because my legs and back were so bad, you got used to me sitting on a chair in front, and occasionally I'd still get up and move. With Zoom, you got reduced mobility. You're stuck, right? There you are, staring at the screen. I can't go anywhere. If I go off the screen, you wonder what happened to him. It basically is low. So his argument was Zoom is stressful. It makes it hard for all of us to do this. Now, does this turn out to be a problem? And this is where I'm going to go back to that study by the Pew Corporation.
Hi, Professor Roloff. Sorry to interrupt. We're past the hour, so a couple more minutes, and then we'll let everybody
I'll be
get
done
back.
right quick.
Awesome,
Last
thanks.
finding. Okay. Basically, what they find is that when they interviewed people, among those who use video conferencing services, 63% say they're fine with the amount of time they spend on video calls. Only 37% report they're worn out. So most people say it's working okay for them. And in general, teleworkers view video conferencing and instant messaging platforms as a good substitute for being in contact with their colleagues. 65% say it's okay and 35% say it's not. So I've talked all through again. I thought there'd be more time, but I get carried away. I'm just as bad as I ever was in that reason. I am narcissistic. I may not like to see my image, but I like to hear the sound of my voice. Regardless, I think the takeaway, hopefully, for some of this is that there's a lot of stuff out there talking about changes that have suddenly occurred, and those changes have been studied for a long time. In fact, if I had to reach the conclusion about what's happened, is I think corporations, organizations have basically taken telecommuting and information technologies and just increased their intensity. They already had them there. It's not a dramatic change, and many of the effects that were there before the pandemic are occurring as it continues. Will it continue in the future? I have no idea. When I see ferment among employees who say, I want to do more of this, I kind of think maybe that will indeed happen. There may be enough adjustment in the marketplace where people like working from home. And then what we're going to have to do is organizations are going to have to figure out how to accommodate that, which may include changing managers to figure out how do I deal with people who are not physically present at the time, okay? So as always, I apologize for talking so much. If there's any time left, I'll answer questions. But you know what? I'm still on email. Send me an email, just like you always did, and I promise I'll respond.
Wonderful. This was really special. Thank you, Professor Roloff. I'm not brave enough to open it to questions, so we're not going to do that. No, I hope, really, really important lessons and learnings and takeaways for individual contributors and managers alike. And I know that I'm going to stop looking at myself on all my Zoom calls as well. Try to anyway. So nothing but gratitude for everybody that attended today and Professor Roloff. We are off next week, but 2 weeks from today, I think it's 2 weeks from today, we are going to have a presentation from Professor Nashir Contractor talking about how star performers know how to leverage their networks, and star performers also leverage their networks in a different way during crisis like a pandemic. And he's going to be talking about tricks, tips, understandings of how to leverage your network differently during crisis. So that's in 2 weeks. But again, thank you so much, everybody. This has been very, very fun. Thanks a lot, Professor Roloff. And I'll let everybody get off to their day. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, Roloff.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a
I
great
just
week,
can't go
everybody.
get any cookies during the break. No cookies.
I'm selling Girl Scout cookies. I'll bring some Girl Scout.